Hello and welcome back to Kingdom Compass Podcast. As always, my name is Tanner and joining me today is my lovely wife, Michaela.
Hi everyone.
Welcome back, Michaela. Glad you can hop on this podcast with me again.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here.
So, we've been away for a while, taking a little hiatus from the whole podcast scene, which wasn't really intentional. It just kind of happened because of our really busy lives, and as subscribers, all 9 of you know that Alex, my friend Alex, and I started our frequently asked questions series for this podcast, which we will be continuing today. But sadly, Alex couldn't join us because he also is very, very busy with everything. But shout out to my bro, Alex. Miss you, man. Always love you, bro. But I'm super excited to have Michaela joining me. It's always, I don't know. I always like doing it with you. I mean, obviously because you're my wife, but just because, like, I feel like, I don't know, you just bring so much perspective and wisdom just to the episodes, and I always appreciate it. So, yeah. What are we going to be talking about today?
Well, we were discussing it, and we were thinking about a kind of a frequent question that's been asked is, what is the purpose of life? Or whenever somebody asks the question, it's like, what is my purpose? So we just thought we would kind of unfold that and talk about it and just give some insight to what we've discovered from our experiences and others' experiences that we've learned from professors and mentors and different things. So that's kind of what we're thinking about.
A little flavor. So like Michaela said, we were just kind of we were wrestling with a couple different topics that we wanted to talk about, but this one just kind of kept sticking out to us because I feel like it's something we've been talking about in our personal lives recently, but also just like has been a theme over this past year that's just been kind of like consistently, I feel like, come back around of what are we here for? And that's one of the topics, coincidentally, that we wanted to address when we were forming this whole frequently asked questions series. That was one of the topics there, was what are we here for? What is our purpose? And to clarify, we don't want to come in here today and tell you like, hey, this is the career path you need to choose.
We know everything.
Yeah, no, we're not coming at it from that angle. A little bit of a different angle that we're going to be coming from. But
just some little nuggets.
Yeah, mainly just like the overarching purpose of our lives, like, because we are put here on this earth for a reason, an ultimate reason, and that it's multifaceted in the sense that it is an overarching reason, but can be expressed in a multiplicity of ways, in a variety of ways. So don't think that we're coming at this, again, we're not coming at this to say like, oh, you need to make sure you're doing this or doing that, for your life to have any purpose or semblance of purpose, but just to say like, hey, this is what we believe we were created for, as we've come on this journey of faith, and we feel like what the scriptures have to say just very well expresses and summarizes the purpose of what life is all about, what we as human beings are here for, and why we have such a yearning to answer that question of what are we here for? What is my purpose? Why is that even something that comes into our brains, So yeah, that's kind of where we wanted to dive into today. And I think probably the best place to start would be page 1 of the Bible.
Jesus.
Yeah. Jesus is the answer. Which we will get to Jesus.
I said Genesis.
Oh, I thought you said Jesus. Okay. Oops.
I said it weird. So.
I didn't catch the N in there, so it just sounded like a very faint Jesus. So glad we clarified that. Yes, the first book of the scriptures is Genesis.
I mean, he was there, but anyway.
Oh yeah.
That's too far ahead.
We're getting ahead of ourselves. That's in the Who is Jesus episode. But we will be talking about Jesus later. Jesus, not Genesis. We are talking about Genesis now. Anyways, getting back on track. We're opening up to the first page of the Bible. So if you do have a Bible with you, definitely open up to chapter 1. And yeah. So I guess it's technically in my Bible it's actually page 3. So I'm sorry. I might have overstretched a little bit. But
mine is page 1.
Yeah, mine is page 1. We're on chapter 1 of the Bible. So I think the best way to start is just to start reading this. What's going on in chapter 1, basically, if you haven't read it before, is what God is doing. Excuse me. What God is doing is He's creating. That's basically what's going on in chapter 1. Is like God filling the cosmos with His intimate presence and bringing to life, the cosmos as we know it. And there's so much that we could talk about with Genesis 1, but like we already said, we're going to focus on this one specific theme. So, sorry for all you Bible nerds out there that we're not diving super hardcore into Genesis.
Maybe someday.
Someday we definitely will. We kind of touched on it on a previous episode. But anyway, what goes on is, if you know the story or don't know the story, what goes on is God creates the world, and it's patterned in a 7-day structure, which was a common storytelling structure in the ancient Near East for creation stories, essentially. So the Bible is basically writing in the context, right? In its original context, it's writing to the people of Israel who are reading this, and they're reading in the context of the ancient Near East, trying to understand, okay, how did we get here, right? What is our purpose? How did we get here? And it's patterning itself off of something, a material that they're familiar with, essentially. So just want to clarify that when I say, this 7-day creation structure is patterned off other ancient Near Eastern works, it's not to say necessarily that the Bible's copying off other things, as much as to say God is choosing, in the context that this story is being told, God is using a story structure that these people are familiar with.
It's kind of like if you're familiar with how Paul used to speak to the different churches in his letters. He would use different like poetry and things that were like relatable that they could understand on like human terms. So it's kind of similar to that, but a little different.
Yeah, that's a good way to phrase it, because it's essentially like, it's like if we were to go back in time or even in the future and talk to someone about, using our modern day slang or our modern day stories, like people may not understand what we're talking about. Yeah, stuff like that. So all that is to say, that's the only little side theological rant I'll go on with that. But that's what's happening in the story, and that's why it's patterned as like God created the world in 7 days. And so we get to the 6th day, and what it says, if you want to read along in verse 26, right? At this point, God has made everything else in creation, and He's declared it good. God has defined at this point what is good in the world, because He Himself is goodness, right? He is everything good. In Him is all goodness. So God has declared from His goodness and brought forth goodness into creation. And so the last thing He makes, verse 26, it says that, then God said, let us make man in our image. Man being humanity.
Not just like like a male, just like man as in like human.
Yeah. The Hebrew word is Adam, which is where we actually get our English transliteration Adam. But essentially, it's let us make man, humanity, in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in His own image. In the image of God He created him, male and female He created them. And God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. So we can stop there for now. Essentially, so what's going on here, right? There's a lot to unpack with just those couple of verses, but it's really cool stuff. So essentially, God saves the best for last in a way. What he's doing is he's making humanity at this point, forming humanity in Genesis 1. In Genesis 2, you get a separate creation story that even dives into more intimate detail of God. It says he breathes his breath, or his ruach, which could mean also spirit, his intimate spiritual self into us. He gives us the sense of spiritualness, right? We're not just something that's solely formed from the dust. We're not just merely dust, but we are an amalgamation of spiritual and material beings, right? Which is part of what's so crazy about all this creation stuff. But what does it mean right here when we're reading in chapter 1? It says, God says, let us make man in our image. What does that mean? Because that's kind of our jump off point for this whole discussion is, well, what are we here for? What is our life as humans really all about? And it really starts right here, is God making us in his image. Well, what does that mean? What does it mean to be made in the image of God? And this is something, again, that's come up a lot recently in our personal devotional lives, and just a common theme going on. So what does it mean to be made in the image of God? Michaela, I'm going to open it up to you. What are some thoughts that are going through your head right now?
I think that there are many ways to look at this, because I feel like the word image has so many different meanings, like in our own culture and in past cultures. So I think it's interesting to think about it being made in his image. I think that just kind of looking specifically in Genesis, it can kind of start out with the fact that God had created everything to be good. So since God himself is good, and what an image usually is like a reflection of something, the way you want to be perceived, the way that you want to be like known. So I think that it is a very loaded like concept, because God wants us to be in his image. So as people that are image bearers of God, created that way, we are to imitate who he is in his goodness. And only God can define that. Yeah. So if that's what we're created to be, according to what we're reading here, then that's what we're supposed to be doing. Yeah. And there's not really a way to know how to, unless we are either learning from God's word, what image means, or what being an image bearer is, or by coming together to study, or being with fellow people that are like-minded. I think there are many ways to kind of unravel this, and I think there are so many different images that God has created. Just like he's created so many different types of animals, he's created so many different types of people. And I think that image is something that it's just who you are, what you look like, what you're reflecting. And in this case, it's like we're supposed to be mirroring God as an image, to be like him to others and reflect that. Yeah, it's unified but not uniform. There's a difference between uniformity, which is all the same thing, and unified, which is like all the same goal. Yeah. Differences but same goal. I think just image in itself is one of those things that is an ongoing, like, everlasting process, because I don't think that we're ever going to just be like the image of God. I think we're always going to be growing into that and what he created us to be. Yeah, I think that's true because of where we're at currently. So I think in our current human state, I think to unpack some of this, we want to again read it from the context of, and you're bringing up a lot of great points of what this is a loaded term, and there's so many ways that this can be there's just a lot unpacked. Of avenues to go through the idea of being an image bearer of the creator. But the general concept, you've basically hit the nail on the coffin of what this terminology means of being created in God's image.
is to be a reflection of God's goodness into creation, right? So to unpack it from the ancient context, when they're reading this, when the ancient Israelites, right, they're reading this passage, or even just like any ancient person, if they're reading alongside, with their fellow Israelite neighbors,
They're like, what?
yeah, if they're well, hearing, I guess, not reading, but anyway, whenever they come across this text, it's meant to be a text where you pause and just chew on this for like a second, because it's such a amazing thing. And the reason for that is when you in the ancient world, the concept of being made in God's image is not something new, right? Again, kind of like we were talking about with the 7-day creation structure of Genesis chapter 1. That's not like something...
It's kind of like an idol, right?
Well...
Sort of.
Here, yeah. So, we're getting there. So basically, it's not something necessarily like... It's not an unheard of concept to be made in God's image, right? The difference between what the biblical text here is saying and other ancient Near Eastern texts or concepts of being made in God's image is that this title of image bearer was specifically reserved for kings, right? Like Pharaoh or just whatever ancient Near Eastern king you can think of, right? It was reserved for them specifically. And it was their way of saying, like, okay, I am made in the image of God. Therefore, that gives me the right to go out and, manifest destiny, perform conquest, right? Go slaughter and take over and subjugate other people. That's how they use that terminology, image bearer, image of God. However, again, this is where the biblical text differs, is it makes the radical claim of saying that all humanity, right? Not just the kings, not just the people in power, not just the elite, but all humanity, every single one of them, are made in God's image, made to be reflections of God's goodness. Like when a king wants to remind the land of who rules the land, right? They make statues of themselves throughout the land. Well, we're even greater than statues. We're living and breathing embodiments of, again, in Genesis chapter 2, it says that God forms Adam, man, or humanity, right? He forms man from the dust, and then it says he breathes into them. His ruach, he breathes into them. Again, that Hebrew word ruach can mean breath or spirit. So it's this idea, this concept of forming this, this, I don't want to say vessel, because that's a whole nother, thing that I could, little theological tangent I could get on, but forming humanity to not just be some mundane creation,
kind of?
Yeah, but forming humanity to be an amalgamation of spiritual and material, right?
Yeah.
More than just material beings. We're spiritual and material beings, and that kind of shows. I like the way N.T. Wright puts this when he talks about this passage. He says, to be an image bearer of God is to be someone who reflects God's goodness into creation, right? And reflects creation back to God, right? We are the midway point, the way he puts it. We are the midway point of creation. And so this was a radical concept. Even though it's not an totally unfamiliar concept in the ancient world, it is a radical concept, as you're talking about.
For everyone, because of like the way they structured their society.
Yes. And that gets on into, as we read on in this passage, okay, so God makes them in his image, right? He makes them to be image bearers. What does that mean? Well, okay,
and also another thing I wanted to like add on that I thought was interesting, something I hadn't exactly thought of in this way, but it's interesting because I feel like it gives humanity like a great purpose of just the fact that they like that we are made in God's image. It's kind of like we have rights, like we have this opportunity and this authority to be able to, like, as it goes on and talks about, subduing the earth and being fruitful and multiplying and being able to, pass on, God's goodness by doing that.
Mm-hmm.
And not just, in giving birth, but just in building relationships and growing people and growing each other together, and I just think it's interesting because it's like in that section where it's saying that God created man in his own image, it's like he's giving that to humanity. Like, for example, like you're just talking about the people, then they were like, there's no way that we're image bearers because there's only those deities that are that image.
Or well, no, yeah, Pharaoh, right?
Yeah.
Like I keep referencing Pharaoh because in Egyptian culture they genuinely considered him to be like the embodiment of God, like
but,
in flesh.
Yeah, and that's what I'm saying. Like for like the civilians, like they probably just saw that and they were like, how could that even be possible? Just from that setting. But it's just really cool because it's like God gives those rights to the people.
Yeah, and so, I think that kind of gets on to what we're about to talk about. Okay, so we've kind of unpacked a little bit of that terminology of, that might seem foreign to some of us of like, you're made in God's image. It's like, okay, cool. What does that mean? Well, we've unpacked some of that terminology already of like, okay, it means that you are meant to be a reflection of God's goodness and his intimate goodness is the way I like to phrase it. His intimate goodness. As an image bearer, you are someone who is meant to relationally partner with the God of the universe, right? To share his joy with creation. Tim Keller puts it that way. He says, if God himself is self-sufficient, right? Meaning that he didn't need to make humans. He didn't need to make us to satisfy some need in himself. He, being who he is self-sufficient, right? He is fully okay on his own. But, God did create us. And if God is self-sufficient, what other point would he have to create us if it wasn't to share the joy and love that he himself experiences, right? Because we believe, again, this is a whole theological tangent we don't have time to totally unpack, but if God is three persons in one being, right? Father, Son, Spirit, this is common Christian doctrine. He's three persons in one being, Father, Son, Spirit. Think of like how a cube has several different faces, but is one solid object. God is self-sufficient. He is fully capable of being okay in his own relational state.
Because his being is relation.
Yeah, his being.
He's in relationship with his being.
Yeah, his very being is one of communal love, one of communal self-giving love. But what other purpose would he have then to create us, all of creation, if it weren't to share his joy and love that he himself experiences?
Which just shows the goodness of God.
Yeah.
And like in his essence that he is good and desires good, because not only like he could be fine on his own. It's not like he just wanted to create little like servants, to like worship him. It's like that he wanted to share his goodness,
which again is the opposite of most other ancient Near Eastern texts, because if you're reading like any other, like one of the common ones that we always go to in biblical classes, in biblical studies, is the Enuma Elish, which is the Babylonian creation epic. And basically what that one is all about is, the gods created humans to be servants, be mud servants, basically, right? The humans are too noisy. Let's wipe them out, let's send that flood and kill them and make new humans to be our slaves. Like that was a common thought in the ancient Near East. So again, this concept in the biblical text is in its own sense, its own light, very radical of like, not only are all of you made in God's image as reflections of God, what it means to be an image bearer is more than just to, it is not to just be some like robotic slaves, but it's to, if we think about it, if we are made in God's image and God is a being of self-giving love, then we are made to be reflections of self-giving love. So we relationally partner with God in doing that. And so that's what goes on in the next set of verses. In verse 28, God blesses them, right? He blesses them and says to them, be fruitful and multiply. And you were kind of getting into that, but what that means, I feel like a lot of churches have done a disservice to that text because they just basically say like, oh, have babies, and that's not all that text is saying. Like, that's a part of the blessing, is to multiply humanity, right? To spread humanness throughout. But
if you think about it, I mean, obviously at the time, like, the ancient people wouldn't understand, like, what exactly being fruitful would look like. But I think if we put on, like, our Christian lens, we could probably see it in the sense of, like, kind of foreshadowing to the future, whenever Christ comes and we do have the Spirit, that...
We already have the Spirit, but...
Yeah, I know. I'm just saying, like, whenever that does happen, it's like looking back at it, seeing being fruitful.
Oh,
it's like having this essence in ourselves because of the Spirit. We are able to be fruitful because we're able to produce the fruits, the good fruits of, like, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, goodness, and self-control.
We're jumping ahead a little bit. Yes,
I know. I'm just saying, like, it's interesting to connect that, though.
Yeah. No, I agree.
That, like, looking at that, because I think, once again, it's like, I don't think it's just about, like, multiplying, like, the earth, but I think it's about being good stewards and being who God wants us to be. And yeah, I know it is jumping ahead, but it's like, but like, I mean, it is helpful to, like, look at both of those things.
I agree,
and, like,
yeah.
So, I don't know. That's just kind of what I think can be helpful to, like, look at in that. It's, like, because even though at the time the ancient people wouldn't understand the true fullness of, like, what being fruitful would be, it's still interesting to think, like, okay, like, all we know right now is that being fruitful is, like, being good, But I think that later, God reveals that, like, goodness is more than just,
Yeah. Here, the biblical text doesn't go into full detail because it is telling a story. Yeah, and I see what you're saying, because it doesn't give all the information, but it is because it's not trying to do as much of a theological discourse as much as trying to tell the story of God and his relationship to humanity. And yeah, but I do agree that it's helpful to connect those dots, which we'll continue to do as we go throughout the episode. But yeah, the whole admonition of, not admonition, but the whole commission, right? The whole commission of be fruitful, multiply, is more than just, it's more than just making babies. It's about, like Michaela said, being good stewards of the creation that God has given us, and what that looks like
with animals and with the garden and with...
exactly. Because in the story so far, where are they? Where is humanity?
There's no other humans besides just Adam and Eve eventually.
Well, yeah, but where are they located in the story so far?
I mean, in the garden.
The garden, yeah,
which is basically the earth.
Yeah, it's
part of the earth.
In the biblical text, So we skipped over that part. So if you want to reread Genesis chapter 1 and 2, you can read it. Specifically, Genesis chapter 2 talks about the Garden of Eden. But if you are familiar with that, it's basically Eden, right, is the intersecting point of the heavenly realm and the earthly realm, right? And that's, if we're thinking, right, cosmologically, that's supposed to be the starting point where God and humanity go out, and that's part of the commission here, is to go out, multiply, subdue the earth, have dominion over the earth, right? It starts in Eden, and it's supposed to move outward, right? To the full intersection of heaven and earth, right? And so right now they're in the garden, right? And garden is just this imagery used to convey kind of what we're talking about, being stewards of creation. Garden imagery throughout Scripture is a thematic way of conveying this concept of being an image bearer, to be a good steward over creation. And so we've already unpacked, like, to be made in God's image is to be reflections of his goodness. What does that look like? Well, it looks like going out into creation, and what it says here in Genesis 1, being good stewards of creation. Because when God uses those words, right, to subdue and have dominion, we don't often think of that in a good sense, probably, for where we're at on this side of eternity, right? Yeah, because as we'll read on with the text, as the story develops,
it gets distorted.
Yeah, humanity takes that commission and twists it for their own purpose, right? And tries to define good and evil for themselves. Because they fall into this lie that, this good God has somehow held something back from me, which is a lie that gets put in their heads, right? Because so far...
all starts with a temptation.
Yeah, so far, God has given every good thing. He has defined what is good because he himself is good. And he has given every good thing to creation, specifically also to humans, right? Mm-hmm. It says he blesses them and gives them this great opportunity to partner with him in ruling over creation. And not in a way that subjugates, right? But as reflections of God's person, it's in a way that gives, that stewards. Like, I think Michaela put it best there, as stewards, right? Who cultivates all the potential that creation has to offer. That's what Genesis 1 very broadly states is the purpose of humanity, is to be image bearers, and what that looks like is to be good stewards over creation.
Something that's interesting I just thought about was whenever you're talking about the fact that that God blessed humanity. I know we've been doing a study in Genesis recently, and something I've noticed throughout the book is that a lot of the firstborns will get the inheritance, and that, like, for example, like Abraham, like he'll bless, and then like Jacob will bless, and they'll bless like their firstborn, which is interesting because it seems like, and I had never thought about this before, but it's like God has given us this inheritance already because he decided to bless us, as his children.
Yeah.
I just hadn't never thought about that.
No, I think that's a good way to look at it. And you mentioning Abraham makes me think of, so that follows along with the storyline of, so basically what happens is, if you flip to Genesis chapter 3,
dun, dun, dun.
Yeah, one of the spiritual beings who we're inferring, of course, it's just, this being is described as the serpent, but the Hebrew word seraphim, serpent, is meant to convey more of just like, it's not just some regular old snake, it's like a spiritual being, right? And so this spiritual being, this serpent, it puts the temptation, the lie, into Adam and Eve, right? Puts the lie into their heads of, has God really given you every good thing? Right? Don't you want to be like God?
It's like twisting his words, because God did say he gave that.
Yeah.
But it's like you know what the truth is, but like, do you really know what the truth is? Because, like, if you did, then like, if you were questioned on it, then you'd be like, no, like,
yeah, like,
he did give me everything that's good,
Yeah.
But that's something that I know that as application, like, we do fall into. It's like, we do know, what truth is about ourselves, and that could look like anything, but there are things that like are like the truth about us from what we know from scripture or just what we've learned can get twisted just from Satan saying something in our ear of like, well, is that really true?
Are you really the son of God? Are you really a child of God?
Like, are you really enough? Are you really this? Are you really that?
Yeah.
And that's kind of like what's happening, and it's like what God created and intended to be good in us has been distorted from, a temptation that's so easy to fall into.
Yeah, the Satan, which I say that because in Hebrew, ha-Satan is a title, not a name. Spoiler alert, folks. Sorry to burst the bubble. But Satan is not the enemy's name. That's just a title, right? It is the Satan, the deceiver or accuser or oppressor.
That's what we know.
Yeah, the Satan. which again, inferring a little bit on the text here, but that's also coming from years of exegetical work from Christian scholars, right? But anyway, that is the common temptation of the Satan, the enemy, the serpent, right? Is to put that little lie in the ear of like, do you trust God? And that's part of being an image bearer is, right, to be made in the image of God is to be his relational partner. That's what I mean. That's what we've seen so far from Genesis 1 is it's the title of image bearer is to be someone who's wrapped up in the love of God and extends that love to others, to be beings of self-giving love. So part of love, right, is to trust. Like how we trust, how we've had to grow in learning to trust each other as husband and wife. That's part of that. And so the Satan...
that can look like you with like friendships or like with family or friends or just whatever.
Love necessitates trust.
Yeah. So it's like, even though sometimes it can be hard to like understand what a relationship with God might look like, I feel like because we have relationships with each other, I don't know. I guess just like for me, it's just, I know because we are image bearers and because we do carry the spirit and have one another as creation, or ones that were created, by the creator, that I feel like the best representation of how we can love God, even though of course it looks different, because God is high and mighty and also relatable and it's all the things, is to have a relationship with each other in the way that looks in the sense of how we're able to trust each other and communicate with each other, and of course with God that looks like prayer, but I think that is probably the best way that we can kind of look at what that's like, because we know in a way what trust means, and if trust is broken it could be hard, but whenever there is trust, then it's like this knowingness.
Yeah,
it's like you're able to know the other person in a deep and close way. So I think that just kind of looking at our relationships can really help us understand like what that relational aspect of being with God and having a relationship with God is like, even though of course it's different.
Yeah, it is reflected into our relationships that we have now, which is what you're saying. Yeah, is a good point to bring up, because often we think of our relational status with God as something that is like all this lip service and making sure that we utter the right words and all these things. It's like, no, it's so much more intimate and powerful than that. It's so much more about dependently leaning on and doing life with. This is a God who wants to do life with us, right? Yeah. Who isn't just some deistic version or concept of just being super far off, but it's a God who walks through the garden with us and longs to help us, and work with us, and for us to work with him in making his creation a beautiful place. That's being an image bearer, right? But that's the lie that the Satan puts in, continuing with the narrative of just coming to Adam and Eve and saying, but has God given you every good thing? Are you? Why don't you just try to be God yourselves? Right? Seize it for yourselves. And so they begin to, and that begins the plunge of creation into this downward spiral, as I often like to think of it, or not like to think of it, but as I often conceptualize it, or in my head, is this is the jumping off point where humanity decides to start defining good and evil for themselves. Yeah, to go their own way. And that's what the word sin, I think we've talked about that on an episode before, but that's what the word sin, kata in Hebrew, means, to miss the mark or to go your own way, right? And so it's traversing our own path and trying to define good and evil for ourselves. So we take, as we were reading earlier, right, the commission of subduing and having dominion, instead of doing it in a way that we partner with God in sharing justice and mercy and goodness and being beings of self-giving love, right? Now we've distorted that into, oh, in order to have what I want in life, I have to subjugate. And that might sound like a foreign concept to us in this in a certain way, because when we think of subjugate, we just think of, oh, an ancient king going to battle with another place and capturing them. But if you really,
but it looks honestly as simple as, like, for example, like, I know with myself, like, there are times where I'm just like, oh, like, I have to do all of the millions of things that I have to do in life by myself, and I need to get it done, and I just get to this place of, like, being alone and just feeling out of control. And then the moment that I stop to think, like, or if, like, Tanner even asked me, like, hey, have you thought about praying about this? And I'm like, oh, yeah.
yeah,
Because it's just kind of like I'm taking into my own account, even though, I am choosing to, follow Christ and everything, I still can fall back into, me not, like, basically living for Christ, and just feeling out of control. And then the moment that I stop to think, like, or if, like, Tanner even asked me, like, hey, have you thought about praying about this? And I'm like, oh, yeah.
yeah,
Because it's just kind of like I'm taking into my own account, even though, I am choosing to, follow Christ and everything, I still can fall back into, me not, like, basically living for Christ, the way that, I've been before. And it can just be really difficult because it's just kind of like, okay, like, I want to do all these different things, but it's like, have I stopped to pray? Like, have I stopped to, like, invite God into my space to, be the, like, the being that is going to carry me through all of this, because I clearly cannot do it on my own because it's chaos.
Yeah,
so
the one who has defined what is good and can give you
clarity,
wisdom
yeah,
and clarity.
discernment.
Yeah, I think that's a good example of it. And, like, how we've distorted the commission from self-giving to subjugating, right? It is just as Michaela described it, is as simple as going our own way in our, from a Christian perspective of just, like, not giving things to God, not casting our anxieties on Him, not turning to Him for wisdom and guidance. Subjugating can also look like, in our modern context, of oppressive systems of power, people trying to hoard wealth for themselves because they think that's what gives their life meaning, objectifying other people because you feel like you have more control, because if you feel out of control, at least you can control this one thing, whether that be objectifying other human bodies, or whether that be idolizing, food, or whatever that looks
and
like.
I think it's a very important distinction to recognize that these things that we struggle with don't make us bad.
Yeah.
It's just that we just struggle because we are helpless. We are beings that we need love, we need care, we need all of these things that God provides for us, but it's so hard for us to just be like, I need help.
Yeah.
Or I need you, God. It's just hard to do that sometimes because we do want to have power. We do want to feel like we, are a God, basically, because we do want to get to that place because we don't want to feel vulnerable. We don't want to get to that place. And I think that whenever we do that, it can, kind of what Tanner is saying, it can turn into this chaos where, like, people just become kind of power hungry and just want all the money for themselves. They want to make all the rules. They want all the power. And it can just kind of turn into this things where, like, people just, they don't want to care. They don't want to bring goodness. They don't want to be humble or be servants.
We become consumers instead of stewards.
Mm-hmm.
We become consumers instead of stewards. And I think that's a good way to think about it, is like, it doesn't excuse.
It's like get, but not give.
Yeah.
It's like Christmas.
Yeah, we don't say that, and we don't want to say. Let me be clear. We don't want to say anything to shame anyone, but we also don't want to say anything that minimizes how much we have distorted God's good created world, right? How much we have our sin, right? Remember, that's such a loaded term, but how much our distortion and defining good on our own terms, how much that has distorted and fragmented all of creation.
I think that is true. I think that sin, the word sin in itself, has become a really heavy word. And I know whenever I hear sin, I'm just like, oh, like, and I don't know. I just feel like it's really hard, and you just have to kind of step back and be like, okay, like,
what does
sin,
this mean?
Yeah, like, sin isn't just like, like something that's like, oh, like, yes, I am a sinful person, and it's
not just some abstract concept.
Yeah. It's not just like, oh, like, sin, just blah blah blah. Like, I don't know.
And the Bible never paints it as an abstract concept.
Yeah,
it's
just kind of one of those things where it's like, we just can't help ourselves. Like, just that's why we're described as like sheep
without a shepherd.
Yeah, because we like, I don't know if you've seen, like, I watched this one video where there was like a sheep. He was in this little like hole, and then like literally some guy tried to help him out, and then he like got out, and then he jumped right back into the same ditch.
Referencing relevant memes.
Yeah. But, like, that's really what it can be like. And, like, I know I even see it in my own life. It's like, if I'm not depending, like I said earlier, like, if I'm not depending on God, then it's just like I keep getting into the same mess.
Yeah.
And that's just how it is. It just defiles every part of our lives, and we just can't help it.
Fundamentally, let's break it down. Fundamentally, if we are creations made in the image, right, or in the likeness to be reflections of our Creator, then we shouldn't be surprised that if we separate ourselves from the Creator, right, from that relational partnership that He intended, that we would be completely lost, confused, and that we shouldn't be surprised that we have and see others distort God's goodness, throughout the cosmos, right? And so that continues the narrative, right?
And even just say that it's good.
Yeah.
Like, if there's something that, like, God wouldn't say is good, just kind of slapping a label on it and say, like, oh, this is Christian because, I'm a Christian and I say it is.
Yeah.
And then that is defining for yourself what is good.
Yeah. We'll continue with the narrative itself of just Genesis alone. We see recapitulations of the same story from Genesis 3, where Genesis 4, Cain and Abel, right? It becomes good in Cain's eyes to take the life of his brother when he becomes angry, right? Defining good and evil for ourselves. It becomes good in Pharaoh's eyes. If you remember the story of Moses, whenever Israel becomes really populous, they move to Egypt at one point because there's a famine, and Israeli people begin to grow in number, and Pharaoh sees this as a threat. So it becomes good in his eyes to make them slaves and to drown all the newborn babies, right? At one point. And that's how we get the story of Moses, is Moses escapes Pharaoh's wrath and actually ends up in Pharaoh's own household because of God's, ironic justice. Yeah. And deliverance. But you just see a continuous theme of people defining good and evil for themselves. Of it becomes okay. I find ways now to justify behavior because I am defining it as good in my own eyes, doing what's right in my own eyes now, rather than trusting the one who is good, who has given every good thing, right? I try to now discover goodness apart from God. And it's just, when you think about it and break it down to those fundamentals, you start to realize, wow, that seems like a really impossible feat, a really lofty one.
It's just like this cycle that you can't get out of. And it's just like, I mean, it feels hopeless. It seems hopeless, but...
And it makes sense why so many people, therefore, have so many questions, right?
I mean, yeah.
We shouldn't be surprised to encounter so many people, even
And
fellow Christians
and
of
it's
like
not-
being like, what is my
and
purpose
it's
in life?
not
What am I
bad
doing?
to have questions like
Yeah,
at
no,
all
yeah.
because it shows that you are seeking.
We expect it.
Yeah.
Because of where we're at in this in creation, right? In distorted creation as it is now, we should expect to have those questions because we have all at one point, as Paul says, gone our own way, you know. We have all at one point walked our own way and tried to forge our own path to no avail. And so let's again break it down. So what is our purpose? What are we here for? We were created, you know, we believe from the scriptures shed the ultimate light on this, you know, for our own personal lives. If you're not a believer and you're listening, we invite you to at least just have an open ear just to hear us out, right? But we're not going to try to make you believe anything. You are free to journey and listen and think about these things for yourself. But from our personal walk, we believe that the scriptures illuminate this, you know, in the best way. What are we here for? What is our purpose as humans? Well, God, you know, as he divinely reveals himself in the Bible, Yahweh, God, creates humans to be his intimate relational partners in over creation. And that's where we get the term image bearers. He makes people to reflect his goodness into creation and to reflect creation back to God, to let justice and mercy roll forth throughout the cosmos, to be good stewards of creation and cultivate its ultimate beautiful potential and make the world a fruitful, right, and flourishing place to rule with God and extend his goodness to all creation. And what that can look like for our own personal lives, just to kind of put it in an applicable context, is what does it look like for us to be good stewards now, right? Or maybe we pause. We'll get back to that later. So, because I want to get through the whole narrative first of this is what we were created for, right? But then now we've distorted that, right? We've gone our own way and tried to define good and evil for ourselves apart from God. So now how do we get back to being image bearers? Now you see why I did pause. How do we get back there? And the short answer is we can't ourselves. We
are helpless sheep.
But God was not content to leave us in that state, right?
Yeah, because he created us for so much more. And it's like, just what else would a loving being such as God do than to just leave us there? Yeah. And I think that that's also a part of what our purpose is as well, is just the fact that he sent one. I mean, everybody knows that's like, you know, read the scriptures, you know, that he sent his one and only son for those who believe, you know, to be saved, for, you know, all the people that choose to believe in him.
Yeah. But what are you saved for?
Yeah. So it's like, you know, being lost, being alone, being, you know, being in our state that we were of just not being able to be, you know, our fullness, the fullness of creation that we were supposed to be originally in the garden, because it got distorted. But it's like, of course, we know that Christ came and he was the one that showed us the way to everything. He literally would flip tables because he's like, this is not what my father wanted. This is wrong. Yeah, this is not the way that like humanity was supposed to go. And even whenever he talks with his disciples and when he talks with you know, different people, he would talk with people like that were, you know, rulers, like the Pharisees, who were the people that were basically reading the scriptures that we see in the Hebrew Bible, that he would basically hold them accountable, like, hey guys, like, this is what actually this is supposed to be. Like, he was the fulfillment of what they're
being
reading.
An image bearer.
Yeah. He is the image, like the image, and that's what we're supposed to be reflecting. He fulfills that.
Yeah, and so this is where we get into the narrative of the whole story structure of the Bible. This is where we get to what we commonly refer to as the gospel or the good news
Mm-hmm.
of God restoring his kingdom.
This is where it gets really cool.
Right? God restoring his kingdom, meaning his restored creation, restoring
it's like
his creation.
Eden 2.0.
Essentially, yeah. And so seeing the Eden project to fruition, where heaven and earth completely overlap and completely coincide with each other. And so that's where Jesus comes in. And again, that will be a whole nother podcast episode later on of who is Jesus. And so we're not going to delve too much into the full story of that, but essentially for the narrative of we were made to be image bearers, to be good stewards over creation. We have distorted that to where now we try to be consumers of creation and distort good and evil, right? Try to define good on our own terms, which has left us in this hopeless state of just wandering and confusion and chaos. But Jesus, right?
But Jesus.
Hey, we're back full circle to how we started this. Jesus. Jesus, right? Who, the Son of God, right? The Son being part of the triune Godhead becomes flesh, takes on humanity, right?
Mm-hmm.
Fully God, but takes on full humanity. He takes on full humanity and lives
it and shows how to live.
Lives the life of a true image bearer, of a true son of God, right?
Yeah.
Of a true image bearer, and then does the most amazing part of our sinfulness, right? Our injustice needs to be the fancy word is atoned for, because let's break it down again. We don't want a God. Sometimes people can get touchy with the subject of God's justice, right? But if you really think about it, don't you want a God who addresses the brokenness of creation?
Who fights for you? I mean, literally, the fact that Jesus came to earth, like, he literally came to, like, advocate for all of humanity.
Yeah.
He came to literally be the person that stands in the middle and says, hey, like, this creation right here, like, I'm going to die for them and be the true servant because I you know, I mean, it can get confusing with the whole Trinity, but like you know, God in loving his creation, sending Jesus, it's like he loves his creation so much that he will die for them to be able to get them to get back to that place. I don't know. It's just amazing.
This is getting ahead into what atonement is talking about. Exactly. You're hitting the nail right on the coffin of, in order for, we want a God who doesn't just shy away from injustice, but like Michaela just said, who advocates for justice.
Yeah.
Who stands up for justice, right?
Yeah, and I guess it's just really beautiful to see how Jesus does that as an example, because, like, I mean, there's so many examples when you, like, read through the scriptures, but one of the ones that I really love is just how much he stands up for women throughout scripture, and the fact that he had, like, Mary Magdalene, like, literally with his disciples when they were traveling around, like, that was not heard of.
Yeah,
and, like,
she calls him rabbi.
Just, and, like, they didn't, like, women couldn't call people teachers, which is rabbi.
Well, they
like,
couldn't be disciples.
And they couldn't be disciples. They, the first woman that, or the first person that Jesus revealed himself to, that he was the Messiah, was a woman. Yeah. And, like, for a woman,
the first people to witness the resurrection are women. Yeah.
And, like, whenever there was a woman who was about to be stoned to death because she had committed adultery, which is basically having sex with somebody
other than your husband.
Yeah.
Or wife. Because men, you also can commit adultery. Don't get it twisted.
Yeah. Anyway, but that's the other thing, is that on the scene, you know, you don't see the man there, but Jesus covered the woman.
Yeah.
And he stood up for her and basically said, you know, for those of you who are without sin, cast the first stone. And everybody dropped them and left.
Exactly.
And it's just amazing to see that Jesus was that way. And if Jesus was that way, and he is the fullness of humanity and the perfection of it, then shouldn't we also stand up for people that are also, experiencing hardships and experiencing, unfairness and being treated like they're not being fair, such as like, oppression and being marginalized and different things like that. Like,
it's so this gets into so I'm gonna backpedal just a little bit, but you're making really amazing points that we're about to address here in a second. I'm backpedaling a little bit to explain why does Jesus die, right?
mm-hmm.
Because we just talked about that, of like Jesus dying for us. Why? Right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like we have a God, as Michaela has already been explaining in great detail, of we have a God fully who even takes on flesh in the person of Jesus,
Who
right?
really cares.
Who cares about injustice, who advocates for justice. And we get touchy on that subject of God's justice because we
Like,
eventually
what
realize
does that look like?
we eventually realize that justice comes due on us as well, because as we already said, we've all at some point hurt God's good creation,
and all have fallen short of the glory of God.
Yes,
and
yeah,
we
we
can
all
get
know that
really
passage.
defensive
Exactly.
when we get fingers pointed at us.
Exactly, and that's the thing, is we want a God who is just. I think we could all agree on that. We want a God who atones for sin, who wants justice and satisfaction to be made for sin and sinfulness, for brokenness, right, and injustice. It just becomes a realization as you think more about that, oh my gosh, I have participated in that same injustice.
Mm-hmm.
And we can get defensive about that, but you have, I mean, we have.
Yeah.
Like, fundamentally breaking it down, we all have at some point participated in some form of injustice.
Yeah.
We have.
And that goes back to the fact that, like, sin has just defiled, like, everything.
Yeah, because we've tried to define good and evil on our own selves. Yeah. And so we have a God who who has to deal justly with brokenness of creation, but we've all helped cause that. So that's the beauty of the gospel, though, is God wants to restore creation. Yes, through means of justice, but also he wants to do it in a way that can preserve and restore, right, redeem those who have distorted creation. And so that's why Jesus dies in our places. That's the concept of atonement, is making satisfaction for our sinfulness, taking our place, the justice that we deserve, right? Of if we separate ourselves from God, right, by going our own way, who is the creator and sustainer of life, then the natural consequence, therefore, is death. And death, again, a loaded concept, but not just physical death, but in the sense of like decaying, the decay of oneself that leads ultimately to physical death. So we shouldn't be surprised by that if we separate ourselves from the creator and sustainer of everything good and life itself. We have gone this path of death. So that is the ultimate consequence of separating ourselves from God. It's not because God is vengeful and mean, but it's because God allows us, he is just, and he allows us, because he is a good God, to make our own free will decisions. And so we, by making that decision, go down this path of death. But God is also compassionate, loving, steadfast in faithfulness, right? He looks at us with compassion and longing to restore and redeem us. And so Jesus, right, comes down to live the life of a true image bearer. And by doing that, part of what he does there is he dies, right? He suffers because he doesn't play by the world's rules of subjugate. He's a steward, right? A servant. He therefore dies as a servant on behalf of all humanity to take our place of death that we deserved as justice for our participating in wickedness and injustice. And by dying, right, he taking our place, not only that, the fullness of the good news, bear with us here, is that he also rises again to conquer sin and death, to make a way through death, right? To make a new pathway, essentially, right? If you picture it, we're headed down this one pathway, and then Jesus dies and rises again to essentially make a new pathway back to God, back to who we were intended to be as image bearers of God, right?
Yeah, and I guess just like along the idea of like just Jesus' life up until the point of dying, and just the fact that he is like basically our example of like what it means to be true humanity again. Like in my view, I just kind of see him as somebody being completely humble, just because it's just I don't think he did anything without having humility.
Yes.
Because like literally the facts, like I'm blanking on where it's at right now, but it's like he literally humbled himself as a servant, to the point of dying.
You're thinking of Philippians 2.
Yeah. And like just the fact that he even did that to the point of like dying, it's just like, I don't know. It's just a crazy concept to think about. It's just like literally everything he did was so selfless. And I just think that that's like what we're supposed to do. And I know just from my own personal experience that I've gotten to the point where I've like wanted to be selfless because Christ is selfless, but that's also gotten distorted because, of the fact that I'm not a perfect human.
Yeah.
But in the sense of like, I feel like, at least in my viewpoint, because I care so much about others, it's kind of turned to a thing where I like forget to care about myself, and I think that that's an important distinction, because I think the thing is that having self-care is important, because you do notice that Jesus does go and rest and pray to the Father to restore himself. So I don't think it's just about like, forgetting yourself. I think it's like taking care of yourself so that you can be selfless and take care of others. I think it's just I think it's this cyclical thing of doing those things, of caring about God, caring about yourself, and caring about others. And Jesus demonstrates that perfectly when you're reading him and his character as you're reading through the Greek text, the New Testament.
Yes.
And I don't know, I just wanted to make that distinction because I know that's something I've had to learn many times over in my life.
Yes.
So I just wanted to point that out for all of you people that care so much about others and not about yourself enough.
For you twos on the Enneagram.
Yeah.
You helpers out there. No, yeah, I think thank you for making that distinction, because I think that's a good point, and I've seen you grow in that in your own life, of how you've been growing in that. So, great job.
Yeah. So you can't pour out of an empty pitcher.
Yes.
That's the thing I always hear.
And that's where that relational aspect with God becomes so important, is how we become beings of self-giving love, is we are invited to experience the relationship of the one who gives himself, right? The God who gives himself to us. And so, all right, breaking it down again. Here we go, full circle. So we started from the beginning of God created us to be image bearers, right? To be good stewards of creation who intimately partner with him in making creation a beautiful place. We've distorted that. But then Jesus, right, atones for our distorted ambitions and makes the way back to be renewed and redeemed and to be restored to our original created purpose, to be image bearers. And so I think we've already talked a lot about how Jesus in his own life was the perfect representation of being an image bearer. And so looking at the founder, exemplar, and perfecter of our faith, of who we believe has restored us to be true image bearers of creation, I want us to look at in Colossians 3 specifically. So,
oh wait, I have a fun fact.
Oh, real quick. Let me finish this real quick.
Okay.
Of what does it look like in our modern application, right? On this side of post Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection and redemption, of what it looks like now, because we've all at one point or another distorted the image bearing role. Now that we are invited to be restored, what does that look like in our modern sense? What are ways that we can practically be image bearers? So Michaela, share that fun fact, and then we can dive into it.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that, like, looking back to what we were talking about like 30 minutes ago, was that, like, in Genesis, whenever it's talking about, being created in God's image, if you look at the beginning of John, in the New Testament, it says in the beginning was the Word. And I think it's interesting how in the beginning Jesus was there. That's what it's talking about. So it's like just the fact that he already was the image, and then he came to show the image and reveal it. I just think it's interesting, and that's what we're supposed to reflect. Because it's like whenever we were talking about in Genesis how we're going to be image bearers and reflect it, it's like, of course we're trying to reflect God to people, like always, but we have a human example of what that looks like, and how Jesus was, how he was relational, how he literally wept over, over some friends that, they're like, a friend died. He knew he was going to raise him, but he still wept. And it just showed his humanity, and how, like, of course I can get all this whole thing about it's okay to have emotion and stuff, but like, it's just basically just showing that he is like a true image of human, and like, he is our leader. He is the one that we are following to become, aligned with what the true humanity is and true creation. Of course, we all look different. We're not going to be exactly like Jesus,
Unified, not uniform.
Yeah, we're not going to all be, because we all are, beautifully created and unique to be the way that God created us to be. We all have different gifts, which is another topic.
We're a tapestry that sums up the glory of God's goodness.
Yeah. So it's like we're all like little mini Jesuses, but we're also our own unique selves, like that.
Or as Paul would put it, we are the body of Christ.
Yeah.
Like you're putting it.
We all have different parts that we are useful, just like it talks about in the scripture, saying like, you can't tell, an arm can't tell on a leg, I have no use of you.
yeah. In 1 Corinthians. Yeah. To kind of jump off of your fun fact of one of the most common titles that Jesus refers to himself by is actually not just Christ, which is the Greek word for the Hebrew word Messiah, right? Not going to get into that right now. We often think Jesus Christ, obviously. But what is the other title that Jesus uses for himself most often? It's Son of Man.
Son of Man, let's do this.
Yeah. Thanks, Phil Collins. Son of Man. What? But the Greek words, which originate from Daniel 7's Hebrew words and Hebrew Bible's concept of Son of Man, it literally just means human one. That phrase that we transliterate as Son of Man, it means a human one, someone who is a true human. And that's what Jesus refers to himself as so often, is the Son of Man. It's a loaded term, of course, because it has all this theological context behind it. But at its core essential, it's the true human one. Jesus is the true human, like you're saying.
The one.
Yeah. And another cool thing to think about, too.
Diamond in the rough.
Yes. When we're... all the Disney references today. But when we're thinking of... When you were talking about... You mentioned John 1, where it says Jesus was the Word, because he was there in the beginning. The reason John uses that descriptor of Jesus as the Word was God, the Word was with God, is how does God make creation? In Genesis 1, at least, how does he make creation?
We make it in our image.
No, well, how does he make creation as a whole? What does he do?
He spoke it.
Yes, he speaks things into being, which I think is a perfect representation of...
how our words have power.
Yes, of if God spoke, an action happened, and that's what... And he created us to be reflectors of himself. We should not be surprised that our words have power to create or destroy.
Which is very true in kind of what we were talking about earlier, in that, like, when we're not letting another person talk, by not listening and not having their voice be heard, then you are, in a sense, kind of dehumanizing that person, because we're all supposed to be this true humanity, And if we don't listen and hear each other's voices and experiences, then how are we being, the image that we're created to be by hearing what was spoken, and how that we have the power to speak and others do as well.
Yeah. Or if we demonize people for whatever it is, whether it's their political views or their current stance on, or even life in general.
Even fellow believers.
Well, yeah, I have in mind kind of fellow believers right now, honestly, of just like I've seen over the past year, just a lot of hurtful slander being thrown out there. Sadly, even from believers and followers of Christ. I don't know. I'm not gonna make judgment statements, but just saying,
not saying that if that's true, and that you made some messy choices that you're not redeemable or
exactly
anything.
Yeah,
it's just it's one of those things. It's like a grievance. It's just saddening.
Well, it's to open the eyes and realize, because we've all participated in that.
Yeah,
in one way or another.
Like we were talking about earlier, is that we've all participated in injustice. We can't help ourselves. We're just sinful people.
Yeah.
We are in desperate need of a savior all the time, literally.
Yeah. And so we've all, even Christians, this is all to say that even Christians are not perfect, right? That we've all in one way or another slandered each other. And unfortunately, this past couple of years now, we've seen a lot of that coming to light, and it's sad, and it grieves us. And
I mean, it does all the time.
Yeah.
Forever.
I know. It's just, especially we've just being forced to look at our not forced, I guess, but just being having more opportunity to look at these things, to digest these things. I just think that it has been very sad to see that happening, and I definitely think that we need to hold each other accountable if we do profess to be followers of Christ, right? And we've
even noticed that in ourselves too. It's just feeling this frustration, and it's well, we shouldn't be feeling this way. That was something we actually just heard this morning. It's just who is it? Who is it that's hard to love, and we should give it to God.
Yeah.
Give it to Him. It's it's so hard in our hearts to feel this way, but it's once again, it's inviting God into that space where our sinfulness is, and being okay, I may not agree with this person. This person may be frustrating me, or this person hurt me, or all these different things, but it's allowing God to work in that space and in your heart.
Yes, because I have struggled, especially in my life recently, with not retaliating, right? I've very much struggled with okay, I have to continuously come to God and cast my anxieties on Him and be look, I know I can't retaliate evil for evil in this case scenario, because that's not going to help anything. That's something that I think I've definitely been having to work on and have wrestled with recently, right? And I think a lot of us have wrestled with that of and if we have made those decisions, again, not to say that you're unredeemable, but to also be held accountable. It's like we talked about earlier. It's not to dehumanize and say, oh, you're an awful person, because we've all
to bring towards the greater purpose, the greater humanity of that you were created for this purpose to be good, and by having the accountability and having the, being hey, maybe you could try this next time, it would be, something good, helpful.
Yeah. And it's we had talked about earlier. It's not we don't want to dehumanize and say, oh, we do these actions of injustice or violating others just because, hurt people. There's a reason for why people perpetuate hurt on each other. But we also don't want to minimize it either and say oh, well, it's whatever. It's no, there needs to be reconciliation for these things. There needs to be restoration of these things. So all that is to say, getting back on track of, I know that we've all struggled, probably especially recently, with trying to not retaliate and trying to not repay evil for evil. But that is part of what it looks like now, especially if you are a follower of Christ, of you have been called out of darkness and into His light. which is a metaphor for you have been called out of the old way of how we would live, of defining good and evil for ourselves, and you've been called into a new way of life, of trusting, right?
A higher purpose.
Yeah, of trusting God's intimate goodness and sharing that intimate goodness with others. So, reading Colossians 3 real quick. Michaela, if you want to read, you can. But basically, Paul right here in Colossians 3 gives a good example of what it looks like to, like some practical concepts of what it looks like to be, practically speaking, a restored image bearer. So Colossians 3, starting in verse 5. Michaela, if you want to read.
Put to death, therefore, what is earthly in you, sexual immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, and covetousness, which is idolatry. On account of these, the wrath of God is coming. In these you too once walked, when you were living in them. But now you must put them all away: anger, wrath, malice, slander, and obscene talk from your mouth. Do not lie to one another, seeing that you have put on the old self with its practices, and have put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge after the image of its creator.
Mm-hmm.
Here there is not Greek and Jew, circumcised and uncircumcised, barbarian,
Scythian,
slave, free, but Christ is all and in all. Put on then, as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience, bearing with one another, and if one has a complaint against each other, forgiving each other as the Lord has forgiven you, so you also must forgive. And above all these, put on love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony. And let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, to which indeed you were called in one body, and be thankful. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly, teaching and admonishing one another in all wisdom, singing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs and thankfulness in your hearts. And whatever you do in word or deed, do everything in the name of the Lord, giving thanks to God the Father through him. That is honestly everything to live by as a Christian.
Yeah, I know. That's why I decided to read that excerpt.
if you're ever what do I do as a Christian to try to really put on what it means to have yourself that you're as your old self, the self that you're maybe not proud of, or self that you're you're not really wanting to be, but you're wanting to be renewed through Christ and trying to be like that. That is such a great verse or chapter to live by. Section
being clothed in Christ, which is actually, fun fact, this is a common thread theme throughout the scriptures, is in Genesis 3 when Adam and Eve separate themselves from God, right, and go down the path of sin, right, doing their own thing. One of the biggest things is they realize that they are naked, essentially, that they realize there are distinctions between them, that there are these distinctions between them, and they feel like they can't trust each other anymore. So, but what God does, and this is an act of great grace on his part, is, if you remember the story, he makes clothes for them to cover themselves. And now, flash forward to, again, following the narrative, flash forward all the way to Colossians 3 now, of following this theme, right, of God clothing us, putting off the old tattered clothes, right, and now clothing us in Christ, clothing us in the new self, right, where these distinctions, Jew, Greek, Scythian, slave, free, these don't matter anymore, but Christ is all and is in all. If you have been called, if God has redeemed you, right, and brought you into this new restored way of being true humanity, right, that means he has clothed you with Christ himself, essentially. It's a metaphorical theme that continues throughout the scriptures. Just thought I'd throw that that little Bible nerd fact in there. But yeah, kind of like Michaela said, if you're ever wondering What are some ways that I can practically think about being an image bearer, being a good steward of creation? Well, right here, Paul lays it out perfectly. Put on compassionate hearts, as God has been compassionate towards us. Let's humanize others instead of demonize them. Let's humanize them and be compassionate towards them. Let's not underplay or underscore the value of kindness, because a lot of people are not kind, right, in our world. Right? Let's not undervalue kindness. Let's bind each other up in love. Let's let's not continue to speak obscenely towards each other, but have patience, humility, right? Forgiving each other. These are just like some very practical ways that you can be an image bearer. Right? What is it? What is the purpose of my life? Well, it's to be an image bearer of God, right? To be a reflector of God's self-giving love. Well, what does that look like to be a person of self-giving love, to be a good steward of creation? And Michaela, are there any other practical ways that you could think of, that you've seen at least in your life, that you could think of this?
Of what is being
now that we have been restored to this role through Christ's death and resurrection, what does it look like now to put on true humanity, to be truly human? How have you practically seen that play out in your life, I guess, to bring it home for our listeners?
I feel like the main thing that's coming to mind right now that I just kind of live by is really just being Christ to people. And the only way to really know what that looks like is by learning who he is through the people that knew him. And that's in, the letters and in the people that really studied him, like such as Paul. And I guess just with all of that, I think the main thing that's also coming to mind is just the fact that, as I mentioned earlier, that Christ literally emptied himself. And I think that that's, once again, something that's really needed, something that I really try to, as much as I can, is empty myself, just to think about like the golden rule that everybody learns about, it's just like, to honestly just, like, seriously, it's not even like just like a little kid thing. It's like just
listen up, people.
It's just like, seriously, like, treat others as you would want to be treated. Like, that just seriously applies to everything.
Love. That's love.
That applies to everything. And it's being selfless. It's considering, like, okay, like, how can I help this person? How can I really care for them? How can I really listen to them and really show them that I respect them? Even if, there are disagreements, or even if you really don't understand because maybe they have a different lifestyle or they have like a different way of living, just depending on many different factors. It's just really just trying to hear them out and see, not just assume what they need or want, but just really just hear what they have to say and what they really need. Because oftentimes most people just really need somebody to listen. And that was something that Jesus did, is, whenever with the paralyzed man, he didn't just say like, hey, like, I'm going to heal you because I'm Jesus, I'm going to heal you. I need to heal you. He's like, what do you need?
Yeah.
He's like, would you like to be healed? And like,
what can I do for you?
Yeah. And the man was like, I can't walk, nobody really helps me. I need to get in the pool. So, and Jesus healed him and helped him.
It's in John 5, if anyone wants to read that later.
Yeah. And it's just kind of thinking about really what would Jesus do.
WWJD, man. Yeah.
But honestly, though, I think that question needs to be asked more times than not, because it's like in our modern day, in our modern context, and like even for generations in the future, it's like, what would Jesus do? Like, in every single context. Like, I know.
Word and deed.
Yeah, like, do everything in the name of Jesus. It's just like, embody yourself and wrap yourself, just like Tanner was saying, like how we're being clothed. It's like literally everything that you do should be wrapped up in who Jesus is, because you're trying to embody and show him to people. Because if we're trying to bring the kingdom here, and like just as Jesus prays, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven, then how are we going to do that if we're not, focused on being Jesus to other people and trying to follow the mission that he started?
Yeah, and in our personal lives, it's looked like standing up towards injustice for the people who are oppressed, like, specifically in our personal lives,
It's the poor you'll always have with you.
Yeah, we're working towards finding sustainable solutions for those who are suffering from poverty, which comes by broken, selfish systems. It's like looking out for the least of these. That's how Jesus often describes it, looking out for those who have nothing, not expecting to get a reward out of it.
And honestly, like, like we're talking about a lot of justice and stuff, but it can honestly look like, just no matter what kind of job that you have, like, being truthful in it.
Yeah.
Being the best whatever that you are in that, like whether you're like, a mathematician or a doctor or just whatever you are, like be kind to people and be generous and be helpful and be loving. And don't just, fall into the way of like, greed or, all these different things that, make you not be the true humanity that you are. But just in everything that you're doing, do it to really help people and be there for people.
Yeah. And I think it's double folded of like realizing my life is more than my career. But also, like Michaela's saying, like realizing that even in your career, like in your job, like how can I glorify God, meaning share his goodness and his intimate goodness. How can I share that with others today, including my coworkers or patrons or whoever it is,
Family, friends.
Yeah, family, friends. Yeah, how can I be a good steward of creation today?
People at the park.
Yeah. Whether that's standing up for social justice, taking care of the environment, and like, creation itself, showing kindness and love to the disenfranchised, showing love even to your enemies, as Jesus says, because if we just repay evil for evil, what good are we actually doing, but like actually sharing goodness with others.
And sometimes we have to get really creative with
how
how we do this, because not everything is just set in stone and
it's
like a certain it's like everything that you're doing, and that's where it gets really hard, where you really have to pray for wisdom, because it can be really hard to discern what to do in certain situations and how to be the most loving or how to be caring or generous or like following like the authorities, but also making sure that you're, being kind and like servant to others. It can just get really difficult, and that's why it's a long journey process that like we'll make mistakes, but it's like we're always learning and always growing and always, just like it says in what we read in Colossians, like, we're always trying to put on the new self through knowledge, and growing in that way.
Yeah, being transformed by the work of the Spirit in us. Yeah. And that's a concept we didn't even get to touch on in this episode. We'll do it later on. But yeah, I think that pretty much well sums up everything we had to talk about today about what does it mean? What are we here for? What is the purpose of our lives? It's to be image bearers, to be people who are, as we have now been restored through Christ and redeemed, to be people who put off the old distorted self that slanders others and subjugates, but to be people who are reflections of God's intimate goodness, who share that intimate goodness with all creation in a multifaceted, creative amount of ways. For all of you listeners today, thank you for bearing with us on this whole episode and riding this train with us. We appreciate each and every one of you, and we hope that you're blessed by this conversation that Michaela and I graciously got to have. Thank you again, Michaela, for being my wife and for being here with me today. I always enjoy doing the podcast with you. So
thank you for having me. We live in the same place.
Yeah. Thanks for showing up to our living room studio. Thank you guys for listening. This has been Kingdom Compass Podcast. Y'all have a blessed day. Who are oppressed, like, specifically in our personal lives,
It's the poor you'll always have with you.
We're working towards finding sustainable solutions for those who are suffering from poverty, which comes by broken, selfish systems. It's like looking out for the least of these. That's how Jesus often describes it. Looking out for those who have nothing, not expecting to get a reward out of it.
And honestly, like, like we're talking about a lot of justice and stuff, but it can honestly look like, just no matter what kind of job that you have, like, being truthful in it.
Yeah.
Being the best whatever that you are in that, like whether you're like, a mathematician or a doctor or just whatever you are, like be kind to people and be generous and be helpful and be loving. Don't just fall into the ways and be helpful and be loving. Don't just fall into the way of like greed or all these different things that make you not be the true humanity that you are. But just in everything that you're doing, do it to really help people and be there for people.
I think it's double folded of like realizing my life is more than my career, but also, like Michaela's saying, like realizing that even in your career, like in your job, like how can I glorify God, meaning share his goodness and his intimate goodness. How can I share that with others today, including my coworkers or patrons or whoever it is,
Family, friends.
Yeah, family, friends. Yeah, how can I be a good steward of creation today?
People at the park.
Yeah. Whether that's standing up for social justice, taking care of the environment, and like, creation itself, showing kindness and love to the disenfranchised, showing love even to your enemies, as Jesus says, because if we just repay evil for evil, what good are we actually doing, but like actually sharing goodness with others.
And sometimes we have to get really creative with how we do this, because not everything is just set in stone and
it's
like
circumstantial.
a certain it's like everything that you're doing, and that's where it gets really hard, where you really have to pray for wisdom, because it can be really hard to discern what to do in certain situations and how to be the most loving or how to be caring or generous or like following like the authorities, but also making sure that you're, being kind and like servant to others. It can just get really difficult, and that's why it's a long journey process that like we'll make mistakes, but it's like we're always learning and always growing and always, just like it says in what we read in Colossians, like, we're always trying to put on the new self through knowledge, and growing in that way.
Yeah, being transformed by the work of the Spirit in us. Yeah. And that's a concept we didn't even get to touch on in this episode. We'll do it later on. But yeah, I think that pretty much well sums up everything we had to talk about today about what does it mean? What are we here for? What is the purpose of our lives? It's to be image bearers, to be people who are, as we have now been restored through Christ and redeemed, to be people who put off the old distorted self that slanders others and subjugates, but to be people who are reflections of God's intimate goodness, who share that intimate goodness with all creation in a multifaceted, creative amount of ways. For all of you listeners today, thank you for bearing with us on this whole episode and riding this train with us. We appreciate each and every one of you, and we hope that you're blessed by this conversation that Michaela and I graciously got to have. Thank you again, Michaela, for being my wife and for being here with me today. I always enjoy doing the podcast with you. So
Thank you for having me. No, we live in the same place.
Yeah. Thanks for showing up to our living room studio. Yeah. Thank you guys for listening. This has been Kingdom Compass Podcast. Y'all have a blessed day. Room studio. Yeah. Thank you guys for listening. This has been Kingdom Compass Podcast. Y'all have a blessed day.